All right, this has got to be a clarification real quick, because apparently people might not actually understand maybe how the whole gearing system here would work. Um, my design uses more of a screw. It's like okay, so if you know about these like little toys, desk toys, and you roll them, they're not shaped like a sphere, perfect sphere, but they'll roll just like a perfect sphere for that given type of application, right? Direction that is, right? Same kind of thing for the diagonal. So I had a diagonal that goes directly to the middle point effectively. And it's a very short, stubby little point that it's really just a gear kind of a thing that goes kind of to where the middle point is, except there's a straight line that's there. Okay, so just it's a stubby little axle, right? That's what I'm talking about. But those little, you know, oddly shaped, kind of ovalish cylinder things are perfect for this kind of application for that engine because, well, they're opposed. So, like, there's one that's coming from above and one that's coming from below, and it's an inline floor, and there's an elbow pin, and there's a bottomer and a header. So, a header and bottomer. So, both sides are sealed, right? But the reason why I have an elbow pin is because it goes straight up and down. Okay, it can go straight up and down, and I want it to be anti-gyroscopic, which means now I can use that opposed, kind of piston thing, but they're not in the same cylinder, right? To help achieve that effect. But it goes 3, 1, 2, 4. So it goes from rear to front, front to rear. Then I have a gearing here that can dynamically change the acceleration, meaning gear teeth ratio, on the elbow pin connecting to the angled, weirdly shaped. They have some word. I don't know what the damn word is right now off the top of my head. But what it means is as one is getting pushed back down because it's pivoting where that elbow pin is, so it has to curve down, right? And so then it can press upon that axle, but it's really more of just a bigger gear that's angled. It then can transfer its force directly, right? Which is fine. But that's also one of the reasons why the counterweight system is very different. Okay, so the second one will be at a different angle, but of course it'll be balancing that off of another uh, primary force balance from another piston that you wouldn't think would actually be getting balanced from this other. Let's say it was let's say it was the first cylinder. This one would actually be balancing number 4. Okay, like that kind of thing. Like you don't think it'd be balancing 4. Why would it be doing that? It's because it's at a weird angle that's now at that moment. As my dog likes to scrape on the. We have another dog in the house that likes to. Thanks, Skylar. Love you too. You probably can't even hear this. Anyways, but because of that type of angle, it's still perfectly balanced. Just it also happens to have an opposing balance on the other side, right? There's the up and the down pistons, and so because of that angle, it then means as it rotates, I'm able to get the same piston from. Well, was it the piston ring? I mean, it's an elbow rod. To me, it's a whole fucking assembly for the piston head, right? Because they're sealed using basically piston rings again and oil ring and whatnot. But like I don't need a wrist pin, so it's just straight up and down. What that means for me though is that it's like, oh yeah, no, I can have them be the same length and they move the same amount of length, and they'll go to this angled, right, piece that goes to the center that will then go to a middle point flywheel kind of setup, flywheel clutch setup that's sealed and has multiple points of contact along each point there. But it can also be much smaller because I have the ability to put divots, meaning spaces in between each one of the cylinders. Since I need to pump anyways and I need axles for the turbine, right? So I use a super turbo in a lot of my designs. Well, each one of these designs has instead of a crankcase, right? It's well, these are all kind of going to look like a valve, right? So it intakes using the sides as a rotating bearing journal kind of thing on the side of the cylinder wall, right? Now, it's fine because it gets fresh oil for where it needs it, right, where it's rotating, but it's of course sealed, right, as no oil will come in through that, which is fine, as it comes into the center and or the outside, which is really just the bottomer. So, but the point is, it's like, all right, it'll go in towards the top, combusts, does its thing, goes down towards the bottom, or over to the side, depending on how you want, ultimately, for that exhaust to do its work energy, which isn't really technically work energy at that point because it already did the combustion energy. It's really just removing parasitic loss to the flywheel, right? Which is what I kept saying in that video, right? So it's not going to give you more torque. That's not what it's going to do. It's going to lessen parasitic loss because you can make a smaller flywheel, right? And that pressure from that you think would give you more. It's not going to be able to do that because, of course, it's already expanded, right? And it's going into a volume that, while smaller and it can expand and perform some degree of work energy, it's only helping it with the flywheel because that's stored energy from your flywheel as it'll rotate back up. So now I can remove a lot of my flywheel energy to ultimately have it rotate back up, right? Basic, simple stuff. Anyways, I go more into detail for that. World's best anti-gyroscopic inline four engine is like it's rage baity ass title for a reason. Like, I'm gonna get you. But it's also the thing where it's like, yeah, so that's my shape because it effectively has no ability to have slop, right? It has multiple contact points. It has all of it balanced off of a very counterintuitive, very odd balancing system that not only can balance out secondary forces by having different acceleration points and continual acceleration points, not just from where it's connected, but because of the uh, gearing that's attached there, right? I also happen to have counterweights that are like Formula One's inertial dampening suspension, and then the harmonic balancer, which isn't really a harmonic balancer; it's an oil pump, but it's an oil pump that happens to balance off of the resistance of pumping oil around. Since I have to use oiling, you know, anyways, for of course we're talking about it for the crankshaft, then it's like, well, yeah, no, then, well, yeah, no, and now I need that, right? So it's like, well, it balances any and all fucking forces, which there are tertiary forces, although people don't often really ever care about them. A good way to put it is like the where the wrist pin is for the piston head and where the crankshaft is, because it accelerates together and it creates a motion, right? So like the crankshaft move or the connecting rod moves, which is a secondary force, right? But it's like, yeah, but there's a lever there, and then there's that movement, which now that is on a bearing, it doesn't usually get translated to something that people will ever care about. But I care about it because it's like they combine and they're actually like I think 4 or 8 times. And the only reason why you know about them is if you ever balance like one of those nickels on like it's a very well balanced engine, and it goes this is weird buzz. It's like that's what a tertiary force is. It's a weird buzz. So there's this weird buzz that happens, and I don't like those things. So it's like I got rid of tertiary forces by having these weirdly shaped gears, but they're actually very able to be just stamped and then lightly machined, or uh, cast and then lightly finished, right? Which is the whole point of them. Instead of like I need a big crankshaft or any of this, I can just have this pivot and slide, which isn't really slide, but it's a gear. Anyways, that allows for it to then ultimately transfer its force to the flywheel clutch setup in the rear or the front serpentine area kind of thing for that engine, right? So I don't need to have any of the gyroscopic forces or the weight imbalance and other issues that others have, which is the whole point I wanted to make it for. It is also supposed to be for a sports bike, which means it's supposed to be really, really, really lightweight. And the point for these like little, it's literally just a crank to an axle, effectively, right? Except it's technically not really. They're all one part, but of course they're separated by gear and all that. But anyways, uh, it absorbs if it bumps or does anything. It absorbs not just with the oil, but it also happens to have multiple points, and then it, it doesn't have to worry about the angle effectively getting knocked out, right? Because of the weird shape that it happens to have, which is great. But that's why it's also balanced off the first and fourth, right? And then it has 2 and 3 in the center, which is why it's weirdly shaped. So like this is when I say weirdly shaped, it's because it looks a little bit like an Archimedes screw, but it's not an Archimedes screw. And it's not going to look like a total screw because of course it happens to have, a need to go in between some of these cylinders, but it only needs to go there where there would be ultimately an axle from I used 4 turbines, which are structural exhaust manifold turbines, into a bigger big boy turbine for this to be super efficient. But it's just housings is what they call them, right? But it's like, yeah, no, I know why. But also, no. They're exhaust manifolds. They're literally structural to the very actual cylinder sidewalls themselves and even the crank. So like you can't get rid of them. That's how compact I made these. Because it's like, well, you remember that oblong? Well, it has to have like points of, where it's going to contact, right? Well, that's where the shake weight effectively, the inertial dampener shake weight is, which is also a pump. Which, by the way, the uh, connecting rods where the elbow pin is, that's a type of check valve inside of the piston and the rod, which it's a one-way valve that goes in as it sucks it in as it goes back in, and then it pushes it through, and then it goes back up. It only has the one-way valve, and then it squirts it back out. Right, so it'll always have enough oil in there. Same thing for the headers and bottomers for like where the rod is going through, but also, uh, the other side, of course, is just the header, right? So the bottomers are wherever the piston rod happens to go through. But seeing as how they're on both sides, it's effectively a nil topic. But I also wanted to talk about it because there's a way to make it so that that gear that's there can dynamically, independently, each individual cylinder change its duration and acceleration. So gearing ratio and how fast it will accelerate, how slow it will accelerate or decelerate, right? And still transfer its power. But what that meant for me was there's no harmonic imbalances ever. And I can use, because there's headers and bottomers, right, in the cylinder sidewall kind of thing, but that's for the exhaust to come in, not for the air intake. The air intake is just a header, right? Right, but I still use a rotating. It's a two-piece kind of thing, like a bearing journal again, but it's just plates that rotate on each other, right? And they're sealed, but then it's like, right, and then air will go on, and then it closes, and then during the duration of the power stroke, and blah blah blah, and then you can have it enter a little bit sooner, and then it'll expose like more, and it'll just stick around for longer, and then it'll close rapidly, that kind of thing, right? So it's like, oh, that'll work. Right, it's good to go. But it's like, right, but why would you do that? Is what I hear them, and I'm like, yeah, no, probably because it's a good thing to do, and you're probably not very smart about that. But to be fair, they weren't very good back in the day. They were used. Plates, yeah, sliding plates were used back in the day, but that was forever and a day ago, and there's always like some one off or a few, right? So it's like whatever. But they weren't going to succeed, mostly because machining and technology at the time just didn't make any sense to really do that. Like a pop-up valve would work just fine, right? Until they were like, well, this is overheating. It's constantly knocking, and we need all this tetraethyl lead stuff. It's that leaded gasoline is the best gasoline. Meanwhile, we have low pressure sodium filled valves of the poppet variety. We pour in with the gasolines with the carburet and the port injections to cool off all the. Oh, yeah, what happened to the exhaust valve? Oh, no, we use oil on that one. Oh, do you? Okay. Meanwhile, I've got oil on this one. It's fine. Fresh all the time, let me tell you. So, anyways, but like that allows me to also use the oil, harmonic dampener, balancer dampener thing. Right. Same thing with the inertial because that has to have a pivot point, or not a pivot point, but a connection point. Right. So that allows for it to slip in between those things and have a point where it's able to balance off of. Right. But it's balanced where it is, except it's balanced off of another thing that's somewhere else. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk about all the individual thing was that, oh yeah, no, well, I can have it hang out a little bit longer at bottom dead center and have that actually intake more air for a little bit for mass airflow before it closes off. As the mass of that airflow comes in, of course, it's going to squish, and then it's like, oh no, it'll want to rebound after a point. So it's like, oh, but if I time that just right, I get the maximum amount of efficiency of air coming in, right? Same thing for exhaust. Exhaust comes out, oh, I can have it hang for scavenge at the top. And then it goes back into the bottomer, which is where all that exhaust is going to go. And then it goes off into, of course, all those individual turbines that then eventually go into the one big turbine, which is like, I'd prefer one big, but if I make four and then that goes into an axle and then I have the big and then that goes into a crank, which is then split, the anti-counter rotating gyroscopic, counter rotating with the gears and then like, oh yeah, no, the front and the rear, the counter rotate. There's no this gyroscopic effect, right? And I don't want that. The problem is gyroscopic effect is actually something that helps a lot of beginning writers. If you don't know, you should know about this. Like, most of us are big, ginormous, hulking beasts, right? So that means it's pretty hard for us to, turn over a vehicle. But once it gets up to a certain speed, it's like, oh, yeah, no, you kind of want that. But the moment you have something like this, it's like, oh, this will be the twitchiest bastard. It will absolutely fall off one side or the other if you don't balance and you stay balanced. There's no gyroscopic except for the wheels. That's all you get. If the wheels want to stay up, that's all you're going to get. And so I designed it for motorcycles because it can make it very compact. Very, very like lightweight compact. And it's supposed to be a sports bike, right? So it's like really light, compact. That's all I can do. Which is a good thing, right? But the vast majority of people don't really probably even need it. So turns into, yeah, what if I just make an oblong kind of like add on to like just a straight axle and I'll have a straight pass through from that gear, you know what I mean? For like the elbow, right? And then that'll just go off into like just, a top and a bottom point for where the front and rear, clutch and all that stuff is, right? So, and it's like, that's simpler. Yeah, but it's also one of the things of like, it weighs more, it's less balanced. And unfortunately, like you need more contact points, right, for it to stay always in line, right? And then it's like, well, the counterweight system now needs to change, and so it's like, oh yes, so the inertial dampener has to move a certain, all that fucking damn time bullshit, yeah, and so it turned into, well, no, it's still doable, and for everybody else, everyday application works just fine. Like it's whatever, who cares, right? But for a sports bike where like you need this space and you need this weight and it needs to rev much faster, because like that's what it's going to be. It's going to be able to rev really high, really fast, easily. Like, no, I'll go back to poppet valves. What's the problem with poppet valves? I was like, yeah, well, I need a bunch of springs and stuff. This just needs to rotate. I never need any fucking springs or anything. You know what I mean? It's always cool to, like, I don't really, need the same kind of, because it's instead of semi-open or open, it's closed, like closed top and bottom, right? And that helps tremendously with strength there. But I also pass a lot of fluid, coolant fluid, right, through that because it needs to be lubricated and be able to ultimately spin, right? So it's like, well, that makes total sense when you want to do that for that kind of application, but for, every day, and it's like, well, but why wouldn't you do it though? You know what I mean? Like, it wouldn't make much sense, right? Yeah. Like, why wouldn't you do it? Like a poppet valve. It's like, we have so many poppet valves. It's like, yeah, no, but they kind of suck. You know what I mean? Like, I could burn way less fuel. That's the point, right? I can run really lean. And the whole point of that engine was I can run an oxygen rich setup because I have a nitrogen filter, right? Like, I already have pumping losses anyway, so I don't really care. But it's like if I blow in the nitrogen into the bottomer after, the exhaust has come out, because of course it's going to run a vacuum, right? And it's like, well, that's good. And then it goes, oh, I need all that nitrogen there anyways. And that's a next pump of pressure wave into the turbine, which goes into the axles, right, for the crankshafts. So that gives me power, which is good. You want that. So it's like, oh, and then I have a super turbo, and then it's always ram air. I always have ram air everywhere. Ram air, ram air. Why do you have ram air? Because, well, the vehicle's traveling pretty fast. Might as well use that to my advantage a little bit here. You know what I mean? It's like just ram it, and there's a bigger, and then it goes to a smaller, and that kind of thing. And that's velocity, right? But then, of course, it's ramming a little bit, into that area, right? And then it's like, right. And then I got the super turbo. So once the supercharger takes off, because that's a kind of like a gearing setup. So that starts at a smaller gear and it goes to a larger gear, and then I dump it out. And then I go, oh, yeah, no, now the turbine's going to take over, right? And then once that's at the whatever pressure I was looking for, I go and dump the rest of it into the crankshaft for power to the engine, so I can capture as much as I can. That's all I got, right? That's all you can really do, you know? So it's like, that's the cheapest, fastest way that I can figure out how to do this. And it was like, oh, well, that makes a lot of sense, actually. Especially when I have to essentially mount it in a weird kind of 45-degree angle in that video. There's a bunch of other stuff that I talk about for one of my motorcycle designs, right? And I was like, yeah, it's super, super compact. Like, it's not really meant to be anything more than, like, I think it was like 1.6 liters or something like that. But you can easily scale it. It's just that it's like, yeah, but I was already getting over 1,000 horsepower and well over like 500 foot-pounds of torque, which is like, I don't need that. Like, nobody needs that in any like motorcycle application. What the fuck was this for? Uh, and then, like, now you understand the mind of the guy that's like, min max, min max, min max. It's like, well, I can just dump more fuel in to soak up some of that heat, which is usually what a lot of the natural aspiration stuff is about. It's like, just dump more fuel in, and you'll burn extra oxygen after top dead center by pushing with methane injectors, with a modification with these little quartz tubes to the injectors that then allows for you to just dump in oxygen that's from the filter, right, in after top dead center, which will burn, of course, right? Now, that's fine, usually, right? Yeah, it's like, it has to go somewhere, and it's like, yeah, no, but that's really hot, and it's a lot of brake mean effective pressure. It's like, yeah, well, yeah, you're not wrong. I'm not gonna say you're wrong, because you're right. But I treat the exhaust by having it go into the bottomer, and then I'm cooling it with like constant pumping oil cooling of the piston, and it's respective rod, which is really just all piston head at that point, because then the connecting rod would be all the way. But I call that an elbow pin because it's like, well, there's a rod there. So I don't know. Anyways, but that allows for that to keep cool, but I'm also pushing nitrogen in there. Right. So it's like it goes off into that, and then the nitrogen will come in for the top, usually for intake, as a scavenge. So it's like that will push in as scavenge, and then oxygen rich, and then I can push in with the because that'll help cool it, right? So with the nitrogen, that is. So the nitrogen helps cool it. That's scavenge, and then I can dump in fuel, and then that's oxygen rich, and so it's cold enough, right? And then it then has too much pressure where it's at, right at the bottom, and so like that's the valve. So the valve comes open, that goes off into the turbine because it's lower pressure there, right? But I'm using nitrogen to cool where that area is, and also provide more pressure. Basically, that's all it is. It's like I want to keep the turbine spinning because like that's kind of the point. It's kind of like a jet engine, right? Brayton cycle. So it's like if it's constantly filtering out this nitrogen, it might as well go into the turbine to constantly keep it spinning. So as a result, then it now has a even lower pressure where it's going into because it's constantly spinning, and then it then dumps off into the turbine, gives me a little bit more power, a little bit more efficiency, and a little less gonna die and melt, right? So that's a good thing. You want that. But it's like, right, and if you wanted to, you could burn it into the turbine, right? And it's like, yeah, I don't want to though. I don't really need it. You know what I mean? I don't really need it. I could put a spark plug there, I suppose. I could fire an oxygen and fuel right there. I guess I wouldn't need it though. you know. But if you wanted to, I suppose you could do it. But for me, it's like, yeah, I don't really ever feel the need to because, like, as a 1.6 liter, I can have well over in excess of 1,000 and a 500 foot-pound torque ratio that, it's square, right? Or in my instance, I use a lot of undersquare. So they accelerate really fast to really, really high RPM, which makes no sense to most people. But it's like oxygen rich burns really hard and fast. So you don't want to do it very often, especially when you compress it, right? Even if you're keeping cool, it'll detonate, right? And so it's like, right. Well, what if I didn't have to care about detonation because I have way too rich and then I can burn oxygen after, right? So I'm burning oxygen after, so that way it continues to accelerate after. Even though the piston velocity is quite high, I don't actually have to worry about it being that high because I can still burn fuel after top dead center, which is great. And because it's like an offset. So it's like never technically for that pivot area where the elbow pin is, right? It never technically needs to worry about the rotation anymore, right? So, and it's balanced, which is nice. So it was like, oh yeah, no, this will freaking get to a really high RPM, even though it's an undersquare. It's a slight undersquare. It's a 1 inch undersquare, which is still like that's still a decent amount of undersquare. You know what I mean? Whew. But the whole point of it was that makes a lot more torque. Torque is what I wanted. I love torque. Torque is efficiency. If you have a high torque, you have high efficiency. Every combustion cycle, the more torque you can get from 1 RPM, that is your maximum, right? Efficiency. So, because I have a turbine, I have this and that, and then once it gets up there and once it's hot and all the rest of it, it becomes very, very efficient at being able to produce very high torque at very low RPM to very, very high RPM. And I think I said I can get up to about 28K. That's generally speaking where the vast majority of like anything aluminum, titanium, like I can get further if I got forged steel, but uh yeah, I don't really need more. I almost never push it past like 22, 25. Like it's never necessary for what it's worth. It's just never that necessary to push past that point. Right. But for some people, maybe they do. But when you have 500 foot-pounds of torque and it's like 3K RPM that you're getting it, and you can maintain that basically all the way up to 28K, it's like, yeah, yeah, but I don't wanna. I'm good though. Are you? It's a ducktail, effectively. It just starts skyrocketing up. As you maintain a flat kind of torque curve, it just starts ducktailing. Like torque, you want to have go down so that horsepower doesn't just go off the charts. So it's like, oh yeah, no, that's fine. So that's what I generally speaking tend to do. I tend to drop the torque intentionally, specifically just so people don't have a moment where like VTEC and then the supercharger turbo thing kicked in, yo, and we just win for it. But that's the thing. It's like I have variable valve duration from the sliding valves, right? And then because of the size and opening of that valve, because of the two plates rotating, I can change the sizing of it. That's a lift kind of thing. And then I have timing. I can have it show up a little bit sooner, right? So I have all three in just rotating stuff, right? So it was like, well, this makes a lot more sense for me to do. And it would be really pretty cheap because it's just plates and some gears. And, we have oil and gears. We got bearings. I don't see what the problem would be, honestly. We've had this stuff for a long time. It's just putting them together differently. The thing is the weird oblong thing, and that one turns into like it's a real finicky kind of angle and then like shape. But once you get it, you don't have to worry about it, right? It's that kind of like, oh yeah, no, as the weird, 45-degree angle rod goes through this, what is this, a wall? It's not gonna go through that. Oh my god, it went through this fucking wall. What the fuck? Went through it like it's just a straight thing. Is it rotated? What the fuck? It's like, oh right, yes. Geometry and physics. Great, yeah. Because that's basically what it is. And it's also one of the reasons why it has a ability to go through where the cylinders are, right? And they're a little bit spread and a little bit like kind of slightly offset zigzag, right? But they're not really, really, you know what I mean? They're kind of just in line is a good way to put it. But I don't know. It's that weird thing where it's like they're shaped specifically to allow for this to happen. Right. And it's like at the top, it's like, why are these things weirdly like this? And it's like, oh, right. Yeah, I know. Well, because, crankshaft and this is other thing. You wouldn't get it. You wouldn't get it. You just wouldn't, though. No. But yeah, no. That's another reason why it's like, oh yeah, no, that makes total sense. Um, but the basic simple one inversion would be straight axles, some of the dampeners, everything, and then the RPM would still get up to a pretty high RPM, and it can still rev pretty quickly. It's just not gonna be like the sports bike version, right? It's like that's like I want to put it in the subcompact or like this. I know it's not the V8 guys, but I do have over 1,000 horsepower and 500 foot-pounds of torque. Mustang or whatever it is, right? Look at my inline four; it weighs nothing, and get smoked, get wrecked. Fun times, especially when you can like effectively lay it flat or at a 45 or something like that to a transmission inside of an engine bay. So it's like it's down low, really close in. You can't really get much better, right? Except for like rotaries. I'm a big fan of rotaries. Rotary 12 specifically. So like toroidal, they're circular and they have a big, huge amount of power you can get out of them because there's 12. And I've eventually figured out how to make an opposed piston. I talked about how to grow using electrolysis and stuff. Gears, right? It's like, well, the reason why is because I wanted to make an opposed piston rotary 12 as compact with as less weight, and it can do huge RPM, and it has the super turbo and all this cool stuff. And then I realized like a 2.2 liter over here would easily go well past 5,000 um, horsepower, which is stupid. It's really pretty stupid, especially when it's like, no, 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 there's 9 that goes off. So there's 12, but then I have the center and then the outside because it's a post piston, right? But then those are also combustion zones and I can rotate them off of where the nitrogen and then the exhaust goes in. And so it's like a pack of 3, but then in like the opposite side, right, of 3 of those is also going off. So like both the center, right, pack of 3, so 4 times like a rotating 4, right? Right, but it's like so a pack of 3 goes off, right, but then the outside, that's actually 6. So that's 9 total, but those are only point 0.8. They can only be point 0.8, really realistically, of the total volume, right? And so it's like, "Oh, well, that's okay, honestly, because I don't know if I want more," especially when you have, like, what is that, 6? You know, and it turned into like I have 1, 2, 3, 4 of that. So they go off 9, 9, 9, 9, right? And then it starts over again, right? But it's like I made it so that way they're like a parallel and a potato. So a big bang and a screamer, right? Uh, right. Crossplane and parallel, right? But the reason why is because they'll bleed off into the other one, right? So like the outside will bleed off into one, and then it kind of does the centers will bleed off into another, right? And so that way it always has a 360-degree, constant p- torque. Like it'll slightly go up, but like the torque will never drop below a certain point. So it was like, oh yeah, and then my axles and transmission needs to be upgraded tremendously. So it's like, oh, I need to get the fluidic transmission with the big honking gears, and I need to get the like differentials and the gears and the bearings and all that. And with the size of these fucking huge ass goddamn tires. Oh god. They can still push these fuckers like it's nothing. It's only 2.2 liters. And it's like, yeah, I don't give a fuck what it says. It's not really, 'cause it's like the center and the outside, which by the way, it's like 3 centers of that 2.2 liters, right? And then 6 outsides, which are point 0.8 of all that, all go off at once. And then it does that 4 times, bleeding into itself. So it never really has what you think it has, and it has essentially perfect balance. And it has the rotating ring valves for the center and then the outsides. Instead of like having it like a plate at the top, it has it for the sides of the cylinder sidewall, kind of like a two-stroke, right? So it was like, well, you could do plates on but then it's like, no, because there's a rod there, and I just don't want to deal with it. So it's just like, nope, I'll just put it on the sides, and that's all I really ever need for what it's worth. So it was like, all right, but then that's the problem of too much power and torque. I was able to cool it because I was able to put like coolant lines and everything in between and all the rest of it, right? And still have air cooling, so it's like a low pressure fluid for thermal siphon kind of stuff, right? And then a it still has Hastings fins, but they still run coolant through for the radiator, and I was able to cool it, especially when I have nitrogen to help, and then the oil and all that to help as well. So everything is able to be cooled, and it all is really easy to manufacture it, which is nice. But it didn't make any damn sense. It was like, I don't really need what's the actual limit here of the RPM? Just like, well, they're under square, but they act like they're because there's 2 strokes there, or well, 2 links there, right? Like they're under square, which means I get more torque because then I have the turbine, which is the size of like basically the entire damn thing to the center axle, right? So it's like, well, it doesn't seem like it's that compact. And it's like, yeah, no, but that's because I can rotate it and then it goes all towards the center and then it goes off to whatever side you want it to go to. Or kind of like a snail, but a little less long, shorter kind of thing, right? Yeah. And then I usually bifurcate them. So what that means is I'll have them go for that, the big circular thing, and then that'll go off into like an hourglass style that'll go off to the sides. So it'll go from the center and then outward, and then that'll go dump off into true duals, which sound really cool because they sound kind of like a crackling rocket jet engine kind of like sound. But I'm kind of, you know, trying to dodge the question of what the big RPM, because it really depends on the damn materials you got. Yeah, so, but uh, I was able to get into those 50K ranges, but that was a whole other like bunch of different materials and stuff. Standard aluminum like Hyper-Eutectic and whatnot would get you easily again still into 28K. It's just like ridiculous, like how far you can push those. Uh, for what it's worth, but it would be just fine with 28K, unlike the other one, which was like, well, it'll do 28K and you can do that as a burst load or for a pretty decent amount of time. But of course, it's not really anything but like sports application, right? So most of the time, I would uh, basically place like in a little exoskeleton, the plating, not plating, powder coat, not powder coat, but basically kind of like that, right? And that would allow for it to be much harder and stiffer at the application and handle the heat better, right? Of course, oil's in there, so oil tends to get moved around and now becomes weight, excess weight, right? But it's less dense than aluminum thing, after a while, right? So, anyways, but this one, because it's under square, right? Over square instead of under square like the other one, then it manages to go a lot slower, which then turns it into, oh yeah, no, I could easily turn this to 28K and it will do it just fine. Um, yeah, it's actually kind of fucking incredible, but also dangerous at the same time. Like 5,000 horsepower is not for anyone to really have, you know? Especially when it's like, yeah, but that's only at 9K. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like 9,000 RPM is at 5,000 horsepower, but that's because I have a nitrogen filter. There's pressures here. There's a whole thing, right? And then you end up realizing it's like, what's the actual limit? And I just ended up never testing that. Mostly because it's like, this is an air engine. This is a prop air. You know what I mean? This is an airplane engine. Like, it would make no sense to ever put this in a vehicle because it's like, yeah, no, at like 3,000 RPM, I would have so much torque, right? I would have no reason to ever run this in a fucking vehicle. It doesn't matter if it's 2.2 liters. I can make this way less, like so much less. Um, in terms of literage, I can easily turn it into like a 660, or my favorite personally is the 777, because 777 is the meme and all that. Anyways, point is, um, but it's like, yeah, no, that would easily get you that 1,000 because there's 12 now, but they're opposed. And so, like, that gets me more torque, which means I can easily balance it for an even higher amount of RPM, which then turns it into I even have more, horsepower from an even smaller literage. That's what that is, right? And then, of course, the next step inevitably turns into, well, there's a turbine version essentially that's very similar to this, and that's effectively the end because it's like it constantly counter rotates to itself, which is way easier than what that is. Because like opposed pistons, they have to stop, right? They have to stop at the center and they have to stop at the ends, right at the edges. So it's like if they constantly just counter rotate and burn off of that from the center out, which is what that was on my YouTube channel, then it's like, and there are several different versions of that for what it's worth. Uh, you know, it's like, well, that makes a lot more sense to do than like anything else. But then that was like, this is a million fucking RPM from a 49cc ridiculous bullshit kind of fucking engine that got like no reasonable person's level of horsepower and torque off of it because that's a million RPM and it's at a is a whole bunch of stuff in it for in terms of like this torque converter. So it's like it's moving fluid around back towards where the center axle is, right? And so like then it'll have like a clutch, and so it acts like a torque converter. And then most of the combustion is pretty far. And if you know anything about leverage, there's a center axle point, and then this far away as it rotates is, of course, more torque, more RPM, more torque converted to RPM, then tends to do that kind of a real stupid amounts of you know horsepower kind of thing. And no reasonable person would probably want it, but then it's like, yeah, but there are a lot of unreasonable people, and I'm one of them. So, but it was just one of those things where it's like, I kind of want to make the most efficient kind of thing because if I can make it really compact, it's only 49 cc, right? Right, and yet it burns like a turbine, right? So it's like always kind of making a bunch of extra that it would never normally because it doesn't have to slow anything down. And it's not nearly as complicated anymore because it's really just kind of hollow tubes and a kind of like a spoke, wheel, a wagon wheel, right? But then it burns at the where the wheel part is. So it's like, oh yeah, and it kind of rotates, and then that all goes to the one central axle, which is great. It has a lot of torque. It's a lot of RPM. Uh, it's like detonation velocity stuff is really fun. That's why I started getting into acetylene, because acetylene detonates, and then it was like, wow, what about oxygen? It's like nitrogen filters exist. And I can cool it on the intake, and that's the ram air with the super turbo, as you can tell. We're on and on and on with this. It's like the spokes are now also pitched blades, so like they're gonna suck it in. They're gonna pressurize air, and then they'll pull off if it doesn't go through the hollow, pitched blade, arms that they are, right? Then it'll go in between them, and then those are cooled anyways, right? And so then it'll suck it back in as it rotates, right? So it's like I got a high plenum volume, I have a high pressure, high flow rate. Everything you want. 49 cc is like, no. Holy fuck. I have acetylenes. Wait, what is that? You got some methanol? I'm going to make nitromethanes. How hard is it it's not that hard to make nitromethanes. I can easily make nitromethanes. Oh, yeah, I'm going to make some nitromethanes. I'm going to make it with oxygen. What can't you burn for hydrocarbons over there, dude? So it's like, oh yes, no, the 49 cc, and then if you know anything about the 49 cc of that, eventually turned into, oh yeah, no, I effectively stuck eventually because I was tired of using wings and everything for on a motorcycle, and I was going to be able to take off, uh, with wings and whatnot. The whole structure, like the quadcopters, but it's like a motorcycle guy that's in, right, kind of same thing. Right, but it's like, right, but what if I decided instead to make buoyancy work for me with vacuums? And then like I have this counter-rotating prop design that goes from a larger to a smaller area in the rear. And then it has a bell end. And then I have like all these, and it's like, well, I'm doing all this fucking, why don't I just fucking make a big balloon that's full of I mean, it can't be that hard, can it? It can't be that hard. It's just they have rigid air balloons. They call them airships, apparently. They have tough strong material and strings and epoxies and all that. I can fucking do this. There's nothing that says I can't do this. Behold, the 49 cc engine that eventually went away for my toroidal QVP, all this stuff. Kind of fun little engine that kind of basically burns it's an electrical engine now. I've kind of changed it now because it's like, well, now it's a fuel cell because it's an air engine. So it'll take air, it'll do the standard electro attractive, like the electric flow, stuff that I talked about. But then it's like, right, but if you have higher oxygen, nitrogen, all that, and any kind of fuel whatsoever, or even thermal, like what dust, what this, what that, whatever it is, right? Right. So it's like then tends to mean that I can burn that for excess thermal heat, which they'll then pressurize it and cause it to counter rotate anyways. But I'm like, oh wait, I'm not done yet because I have electron redox flow, which I keep calling it that, but it's effectively it's like, well, in order for this electron to go in and then combine the chemical blah blah blah, it has to do work energy. The electron has to go do something, right? So it's like, well, what do you know? Like a fuel cell, right? And so it's like, oh, that makes total sense for me, especially as it rotates and it has gapping as it'll expand open, but also rotate. So, and then it'll close, right? So that way it always manages to do that at exactly the right time and transfers from its center out approach. Then it will, by that point, have expanded so much that it has performed the vast majority of its work energy, right? So it's like really high efficiency using air and electricity. And I'm so efficient with it that I actually make a ridiculous amount of power off of it. So it's like, oh, yeah, no, well, I mean, it's buoyant, so I can effectively get, especially with a vacuum, to space practically. You know what I mean? So it's like, well, I do have oxygen I can store. And I do have solar panels I can use. I could do a lot. And now I have a rocket ship. Before I already had a rocket ship, to be blunt about it, I was like, well, I can still ultimately, once I get up to the right speed, the right, all that, and eventually it's kind of like a space plane, right? And I just have to switch over to more oxygen and all that. And then I have like a weather balloon or whatever get up as I get towards orbit. And then I swing back around. It's like, oh, I'll just grab some more shit and keep building up from there. And then weep, off to the moon I was going to go. So now it's like, nah, fuck that. I can easily go to the moon. It's like nothing. It's like just get an airship, vacuum airship, just fucking do that and then fucking harvest some air the right way and then to the moon. I was like, I need my rocket ship to do more work energy. My Q value, specific impulse, and delta V are terrible. What is this malarkey? Oxygen and hydrogen of all things? This is BS. Terrible. So I was like, all right, I need to figure out how to do even more. Then it was like, so plasmas come in positives and negatives. There's the positive plasma with too many electrons, and then there's the negative plasma, which is way too little electrons, right? And then it's like, behold, the ionic plasma engine that works off of the same kind of principles that you've already had for like a really long time. And then they just combine into, a chemical that's, exothermic, right? So like take oxygen and hydrogen, for instance, right? And then what do you know? What do I get? More vroom, more Q value. If I'm gonna have to spin that electricity, if I have to turn it on, and then it's like, well, it's gonna burn anyways. I might as well put some more energy into it and use that energy to accelerate it even further and faster in a more laminaristic, equal opposite potential pattern that comes out at effectively near light speed, anyways, that then combines because it's ionic, right? In a plasma. So it can go really fast. You can really linearly accelerate it very well off of both of them. So the plasma itself can be used to accelerate the ionic plasma, right? The positive plasma versus the negative plasma, right? And so both of them can be used to accelerate each other, and they want to combine anyways where the nozzle tip point is. So once they combine there, then that's another combustion just to make sure it really goes into that, and then it goes off into the bell end. As a result of it going through that, well, yes, it technically slowed down its velocity. It gained, uh, well, more in the bell end, effectively, is really what that tended to be. It was like, no, it's more straight. It's more of a standard bell end style of rocket engine and isn't super ridiculously over the top. But I was like, yes, no, so H2O is accelerated to what now? Near light speed? I was like, yeah, no. But I mean, it lost value. It's like, yeah, not that much though, for what it's worth. Um, right. Like it's more about the fact that because of those relativistic speeds, some of it's going to turn into helium, right? And then it'll fizzle off during the combustion area because it can't really sustain it because it, yeah, sure, it's fast enough, sure. But it's like but it's not under enough pressure, and it's not in the way that effectively allows for it to not have decayed a lot. So it'll decay and it'll burn that into more heat effectively. But there's now neutrons. Surprisingly, where did these neutrons come from? And it's like, well, gee, I wonder where they came from. Probably the fucking thing. You know. Meanwhile, what it does is it burns so much of the heat during the fissile and fusion process that it's now traveling about as fast as you can get once it's in the bell end. Right, but it lost a lot of its heat during that process. So it's like the heat goes away, but it gains kinetic, which is kind of the weird opposing kind of thing, right? So it's like there's a neutron here that's left, right? But most of it can be reflected back using the right material and allowing for it to effectively just get brute forced, which is a fancy way of saying, well, the bell end is effectively around where the neutrons are going to go to. So if they didn't go in through that, then they're going to go into the bell end. So since they're already traveling that direction, you know what I mean? Like the neutrons also have mass, right? But they're already traveling that direction. So they also, in part, they're given equal opposite to the force of the direction you want to go in. So now it's really highly efficient, right? Now, it also means I lost a lot of the heat, which is fine. I don't want heat. I don't want pressure. Pressure is stupid. Past the point, heat and pressure just melts and breaks everything down. I don't like that. You know what I mean? That's kind of the problem. You don't want it, right? So what I found out is if I balance this instead of getting to those really high relativistic speeds into the 70% range to 80% range, it'll come out at 99 plus percent range, which is not to 100. It's point and then a bunch of nines, however many, so on, right? So then that gets captured. But my bell end had to change because it was like, fucking bell ends, right? Why do they gotta be like this? So it's like, all right, I have an aerospike bell end, which is not actually technically an aerospike because it's effectively a bell end with an aerospike in it, yes, but it's a hollow teardroppy shape bell end aerospike. And they have a bunch of overhangs on them. And because it's leaning the mix out, right? So there is a degree of plasma here still left. And it's like, right, you know what works with that plasma? The fuel. So if I pump in, because of course, if you have an aerospike and it's hollow, then you have to have something attached to it. You have stators, right? And so all of those mean it essentially constantly captures it, and as it goes over the overhang, it has to expand, right? And it's like, well, that also makes a Venturi, which means a Venturi principle can happen, which then means that fuel wants to add to the plasma, and then it re-expands. So it's already traveling quite quickly, and it's like, well, I need to cool it, right? Because it's quite hot. But it's like, right, but what's the best way to realign and make sure all of the pressure and the speed of that given gas coming out, because it, of course, is going to slow down during its expansion, always has a constant thrumming hum of thrust applied to it. Have it burn in the bell end. You have to. So if you have it burn in the bell end, it'll both cool it off, but it'll also burn right there and expand. It pushes it away, puts new fuel in, and it does it all that's over again, and it has a bunch of pressure. Pressure that's immediately dumped into as fast as it can at relativistic speeds to an exothermic reaction as it exits off to R thrust in as many places as it could be, because the bell end can be quite large, but it's like there's a lot of space in between all those little spaces. It's like the more space I can capture there, that turns into thrust captured as a bunch of little miniature bell ends, the more efficient my bell end becomes in space, especially even in our atmosphere, but especially in space because there's no atmosphere to push against. But I created an artificial atmosphere that I then can push against. So that gives me more efficiency. Perfect, right? Now I can travel much more efficiently on much less fuel using mostly just electricity and standard fuel that I'd be able to get by traveling through some clouds and having some solar panels pointed at the sky for a while. So then I was like, behold, to the moon I go. And bird to the moon I went. That's right. And that's why I did the clarification to the inline four anti-gyro engine all the way for an hour. It's like, this is how I managed to make it so I could get to Jamun using ionic plasma. A ion and then so positive, negative plasma. Give me a second. Anyways, that's effectively what this was for like how to make that. And then I was like, well, maybe I can try and turn that into an actual engine type of thing. Because there's nothing that says I can't turn an injector into that. And that's where a lot of my rocket injectors came from. Like a lot of my rocket injectors are effectively the same thing. It's like I'll just make H2O2 that then combines with an N2O from the nitrogen filter and then hydrogen, water, right? And a little bit of electricity, and then turn it into plasma and a positive and a negative, and then I inject it in, and then it goes boom at top dead center, or I just burn it in. So I use water and air and a filter and some electricity, and then I go vroom vroom really fasty fast. I don't even need hydrogen. I just need air and water and some electricity. Which is eventually how like the fuel cell came about, right? Like the fuel cell is effectively the same thing. It was like, oh, and then I have to perform work energy anyways. And behold, the air engines that you think can't possibly make that amount of energy. And it's like, yes, but you don't understand exothermic. So apparently my comforter is done, but the outside is most likely done, and the center is not. So, anyways, there's that. And then it's like, right. Then we end up having to get into, well, you made a rocket engine. Yeah, for single stroke technology. So that way I don't have to worry about like ever needing to suck, squeeze, bang, blow. Screw like any of that malarkey business, because that's pumping losses. I hate pumping losses. Screw pumping losses. I don't want pumping losses. I want none of these pumping losses. I want that to actually be pumping gains. Give me those gains, man. I want those gains. So then it was like, behold, I shall now do pumping gains. And then I so did. Right? That's literally what it was. So it's like, no, if I pump in things, it's like, no, I then gain more because of exothermic and electron redox flow, movement of the, once it's hot too. It's like, well, there's a plasma in this and a movement of electrons. So then it's like, well, that's perfect for that. For an electric motor, which is also a fuel cell, which is also all those things. So there's that. Anyways, logical step-by-step progress for me was like, I want to go to the moon. I want to go to space as cheaply as possible. Also, well, if I'm going to make a bunch of fucking money to be able to do that, I need to be able to come up with something that's actually going to make a lot of sense for people and be really simple and easy and cheap. And they're like, internal combustions are shit. Meanwhile, air engines are internal combustion engines now with the electric motor variety is right baked in there. I'm now going to do all that and the exothermic recapture for all the marbles, right? Especially when it's like, what do you got over there? You got fucking dust? You got some fucking pollutants? I want those pollutants. Those are going to be so fucking good for my goddamn energy. Comes out the other side because of how it has to do the fuel cell type of thing, like hydrogen and oxygen, right? It then makes it so that way I am now able to separate them. Nitrogen turns into N3s, N2s, which eventually break down to N2s. Okay. O3s will be there a little, but they usually just break down to O2s very quickly. If there's carbon there, it gets captured to a can because that can be either a positive or a negative, depending on how you want it to be in terms of charge, right? Right. So then you end up having, uh, right, dust. So whatever dust organic molecule that can be cleaved easily tends to be like that, which can be oxidized or uh, loosely nitrogened and then exploded with oxygen, which then turns off, right? And so it's like, right, yeah, no, it's just off, just explosive. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, no, a little bit. They're effectively explosives. I'm not even gonna lie. I basically turned dust into the air into something like that. But you know, when you have enough oxygen, almost everything's an accelerant. You know what I mean? So it makes it work a lot better, right? But exothermic is the reason why I'm getting the power I'm getting. Is like that's piezoelectric, that's Stirling, that's like cooling it off, and that gets turned into either electricity or directly into work energy as it expands and counter rotates things, right? Right, and so, like, that's why it goes all up to the center axle, and that's why the air engines I ended up creating were created that way, especially with ozone. Like, ozone in the atmosphere, that's an electron redox flow from the skin to the battery, as you can cleave them, and in order to cleave them with the light that's there, and, you know, some, processes for the skin and whatnot, right, it then means I get electricity. But it's like, "You're burning our ozone." It's like, no, 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 I'm also recombining it by using the air engine to make more ozone." But that's an whole other thing when it comes down to like, well, I do have some fuel. It's not like I don't have any fuel. What is this? You know, you get no fuel over here, Mister. Nah, who said? Who said that? Yeah. So that was the whole point. It was like, oh, I'll make a ginormous. Well, it's not really that because it's a vacuum, but like when it's a vacuum, compared to like hydrogen, a lot less. It's a lot more buoyant, actually. Yeah, the vacuum is like way less dense than fucking hydrogen. So, like, yeah, a lot smaller than you think that a hydrogen airship would need to be to get you up into space with, like, you, fuel, passengers, that kind of thing. And, some stuff to, like, 3D print onto the moon to be able to make stuff, like with metal things, 3D print, grow with the solution thing I talk about, right? Yeah, and then, like, have moon base and then live. And then that's now my country. I make my fuel, I have GDP, it is my mass manufacturer design over here, and then I sell it to you by eating it over to you, and it comes down in re-entry and a whole bunch of different things, and then you're gonna have fun with your, it was made on the moon, and you pay for that, and then it's actually less money than when you pay for stuff that's on the earth, because lamos buy things that are on the earth. I'm gonna make so much bank. There's a genuine business plan here. You know what I mean? Right? Like, it's gonna work. You think it won't work? I'm gonna be $1 trillion motherfucker. It's gonna happen. I swear. Anyways, but that's the reason why the clarification was a thing, because it's like, well, here's a rocket injector. I don't even need this idea of suck, squeeze, make, blow. It's just like constantly injected in, and then oh yeah, no. Well, of course, it exhausts it off over into there, but that just goes off into, of course, the bottomer and then the turbine. Right? For the super turbo, because like, well, that makes total sense. But you do have to filter the air coming in, right? And you do have to make sure that the nitrogen filter is cooled, and you every so often do have to change it out. They are made with high flow up to 60 psi is what it says on the one that I have linked in those videos. And they'll work. They'll filter out nitrogen pretty decently well, right? And they're just fine for applications if you know what you're doing for cars. But if you have pumping losses anyways, it's like, well, fuck it. I'm gonna use this to make more power, right? So it's like, well, air engines make total sense because I'm already gonna have heat, so I might as well make the heat do work for me. I might as well make from the electron flows or the electricity flow stuff, right? Electrical flow that I talked about for making more magnetic flux from less actual volt and amp, which is a very specific type of design of electromagnetic from movement of electrons and all that. Anyways, point is, uh, that allows me to get away with a lot less in terms of battery and power needed to do anything. So it's like, oh, I deliver it very well, and then I convert it very well, and then everything's much more efficient than what most people tend to do. And then I also happen to use the air pressure and then the air around us, because of course there's a vacuum within inside of this design for the rotating thing. But all things need a vacuum or a less pressured area. That's always kind of what that is if you want movement. But that's the whole universe, you know what I mean? So, anyways, behold, energy. Very efficient energy. It seems like it's beyond 100%. It's like, well, there's air, there's exothermic, so, no, you don't understand that there's like a fucking star near us, and like that clearly gives us energy. There's energy inside of the air, man, and like there's energy inside of that too, if you do it right with a little bit of, work energy ahead of time, like pumping losses, and like friction losses that then actually make it so you get more exothermic recapture as it cools it for you, you know, as it's a heat exchange Stirling kind of thing, you know what I mean? And then like if you do it right, actually you could be way more efficient and you don't think there's that much energy, but that's where you're basically wrong and you should shut up and be better at doing this. I just like to dig it in there at the end. It's like, no, why do we do it this way? You just shut up. This is dumb. We can be way more efficient. We can do this way better. Like, no, we don't capture any of this excess energy or this loss of energy or any of these you know what I mean? It's like the rotating of the wheels alone for heat as it heats up. Like I have piezoelectric wheels that have vacuums inside of them that have been vulcanizing and then with the rims. And so then it actually both captures that as it rolls and then adds it, right? But I also, during braking, recapture that so it never goes too hot and never goes too cold, right? And then the braking system alone is actually an energy recapture and a vacuum system that I have on my YouTube channel that allows for it to then re-rotate, like you know, uh, electrical braking, right? Energy, regenerative braking stuff, right? But it's like, yeah, fuck that. I'll just direct fucking to it. It's like, why do I need this transfer of electrons? And it's inefficient. Just this, and it goes. Simple as it gets, right? It's like a spring practically, right? So if it's like, yeah, but I don't need it as a spring, but then I added like this bismuth carbon iodine gas under like gigapascals, but they're really small, really small areas. But then it's like, oh, it's a spring, but that's not the vacuum. I only did that because it was like, well, I can get way more out of that if I wanted to do that. But this one's using field stuff, and I'm gonna move on. Anyways, point is, that means each tire then rotates off of braking directly from the brakes itself. So I don't need any of these battery things. Why would I add more weight? I don't want weight. Weight's parasitic loss. I don't want loss. I want efficiency. I want power. I want torque. I want all of it. If you want it all, you're going to have to do all the work. Can't give up. So it's like, this is what this is. This is what it came from. Now I get so much energy from the air, right? Well, mostly just comes out as condensed little liquid water vapor stuff. You know what I mean? Which it's like, oh, by the way, that water vapor, and if this is dry over here, that's an electrical redox flow kind of thing, because that's humidity versus this, and that's a charge that I can make, and then that produces energy for me. So that's another thing. Once it gets up and running, it makes it more efficient, as it goes through the air. So that's a whole thing. And then it's like, oh, yeah, no, but I can also do that up in there in the atmosphere with my airships, and there's a whole bunch of stuff like that too. So it's like, it seems like it's over 100%, but it's like I'm getting energy from our atmosphere. You just don't know how and why because you don't usually think of that as energy that can be useful. But if you put work in, like I do, then you can. For cheap. So cheap that it's built into the design, it actually weighs less than you do. Which is against conventional wisdom, but that's because a lot of people didn't put in that energy, and there's a lot of fucking capitalism monopolies and oligarchies, right? That effectively make it very hard to push progressive, innovative things. Instead of Devosi, no offense, it's good, but this isn't what that is. You know what I mean? It's easy, cheap as fuck to manufacture. Really super simple, very, very efficient. And it weighs less than a standard conventional engine. It's smaller and compact. Everything you want. So, anyways, bye. Suck my dick and balls. Like and subscribe. Share. Bye. Yeah, I did say that, but you